This covers the methodology of metaphysics. It's important to note that this particular approach to metaphysics is but one of many possible approaches, and depending on the philosopher you're looking at, or the tradition, etc., they may take different approaches. So, what is one way to do metaphysics in terms of academic philosophy? Well, here's kind of a standard model. The first thing is to select a problem. And this could be like the problem of other minds, the problem of universals, the problem of personal identity, or a very particular one. So a person may select, say, something very particular about the problem of mind, or a particular aspect of the problem of universals. And we'll see examples of these with the various readings. The next thing that's often done is to clarify the problem, might be an option, not offer a solution, but simply try to make the problem clearer, which can be valuable to figure out what exactly is going wrong. Think of it like a medical diagnosis. Or one might offer a potential solution to that problem. This is often done on a large scale, by creating a theory. So if someone is writing a book or a dissertation, which is basically like a book that no one reads, that you would create an entire theory to work through this. More commonly, you would work within an existing theory rather than, say, creating one on your own. And this is perfectly acceptable in philosophy. When you're doing work in any part of philosophy, just like any academic field, you typically wouldn't create like an entire new theory. To use an analogy to biology, if you're working in biology, you probably wouldn't create an entire new theory of, say, evolution. You typically work within that theory. So someone working on, say, the problem of universals might work in the context of, say, Plato or David Armstrong's theory, either agreeing with them or trying to argue against them. So if you build a metaphysical theory or a metaphysical solution to a metaphysical problem, how do you decide whether it's good or bad? Well, we'll look at kind of the level of theories, but you could also apply this to particular solutions being offered to particular problems. Now, this model is pretty much an economic model. So the way you'd assess a metaphysical theory or solution would be in terms of cost and benefits. So to use an analogy, it's rather like picking between, say, phones, or between majors in school. You look at what are the pluses to it, what are the minuses, what are the costs, what are the benefits. And as a general rule, you would go with the less cost, the better. The greater the benefits, the better. And this would be the same with a metaphysical theory or solution to a metaphysical problem. You would tally up the cost of the theory or the solution, and then you would tally up the benefits and make a rough estimate. You wouldn't typically do like a real numerical calculation where you'd have like point values assigned and have like a really objective mathematical system for this. It's pretty rough scorekeeping. To use an analogy, it's somewhat like judging a sport like Olympic figure skating, where you have like a system of like points and evaluations, but there's a degree of subjectivity, and of course picking what standards you're going to use is also a judgment. So what are the sort of ways of weighing or assessing these theories or solutions? Well, one of the standard ones, which pretty much everyone who does metaphysics accepts, but not everybody, of course, is what's called Occam's razor. It's supposedly developed by our good dead friend, William of Occam, and you might see it spelled differently. And I've heard recently there's some debate about whether Occam's razor is really Occam's razor, but it's kind of called that, and they're probably not going to rename it. Maybe if they find out it really was somebody else's, but we'll stick with the original name for now. He enjoined, that is to say, told people to not multiply entities beyond necessity. And what he's asserting here is this, that the greater the number of ontological kinds that a theory or solution requires, the greater the cost. So this would be a minus. So if you have two theories that otherwise do the same stuff, and one requires more metaphysical entities, then the one that requires more stuff would be more costly. To give a concrete example of Occam's razor in use, somewhat ironically, because on some views of the razor, Occam argued that because God works in simple ways, and that's how you would argue why you shouldn't have like this extra stuff. It's often used to argue against God's existence. And here's how typically it would go. You would look at the world, and typically one argument for God's existence is the argument from design. You look at the complexity of the world, the creatures in it. This seems designed. There can be no design without a designer. This designer is God, so God exists. Now Occam's razor would cut away God. At least here's how the argument would go. In the case of the complexity of animals, the usual counter is the theory of evolution, that all you need is animals, creatures with DNA, natural selection, and what you would get through natural selection is the appearance of design, but no need for God. So what about getting the animals here in the first place, or creatures in the first place? Well, that's where the theory about the Big Bang would come in. You could have a theory of creation, where God creates the world, or we could say it occurred through whatever process the Big Bang is that doesn't include God. And the argument would be is if you don't need God to explain the complexity of animals, you don't need God to explain the existence of the world, then by Occam's razor, the argument would go, God should be cut away. Now Occam's razor is used against far, far less formidable foes than God, and it's commonly used, to slice away things that would be extra things in metaphysical theory. To give a final example, you can also use it in fairly, minor circumstances. To give a concrete example, there's a phenomena that occurs worldwide and has occurred throughout time, and it's often referred to as night terrors. And the idea is that a person will be asleep typically, but then they'll wake up because they feel a terrible presence. Something malign, malicious, and awful is in the room in them, perhaps staring at them in the darkness. And the person feels that this presence is there, but they cannot move. They cannot even, scream for help. They're utterly helpless. Now, in the past, a common explanation was it was witches or perhaps a demon, and then later on it became aliens doing some probing. And there are so many stories like this, and so many credible people had experienced it, that scientists wondered if there was something to it. And long story short, what they found out was there is something to it, but it's not aliens, demons, or witches. The basic idea is that when you're, crudely put, this is not exactly accurate, but the basic idea is that when you're asleep, there's kind of a safety switch, so that when you're dreaming about running around and doing things, you're not doing them. And what can happen is you can be conscious, and to use the analogy, that safety is on. So you're awake and trying to pull the trigger, so to speak, but safety's on. So you can't move. You're effectively kind of paralyzed. And going along with this is that feeling of a weird, dangerous presence. And scientists have been able to recreate this in the lab. And so if you're forced to choose between demons or, this sort of, misfiring, well, by Occam's razor, the misfiring is the better explanation because it requires fewer entities. You just need people and, brains. You don't need ghosts and demons and such. So that's Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Now, closely related to Occam's razor is the notion of simplicity. The idea being the simpler, the better. All the things being equal, a simpler theory is preferable to a more complex or complicated theory. The old idea of, kits that keep it simple. And so the idea is if you have two theories, one is very complicated, one is simple, and they're otherwise equal, simpler is better. Next is mystery and or weirdness. Now, metaphysics is extremely, weird. It's, one of the weirder branches of philosophy, what it's saying a lot, because we're talking about, universals, time travel, ghosts, etc. But there are degrees of weirdness. So that is this. The less mystery, or weirdness, associated with a theory, the better. Entities, concepts, mechanisms and such can be mysterious or weird. To give a classic example, we'll talk in the future about our good dead friend Plato, and he has these things called universals that exist outside of space, outside of time. They're perfect, changeless, eternal. Yet they somehow do things in this world, and they can be somehow multiply located. And the idea of entities that are perfect, timeless, changeless, existing outside of space and time, that somehow affect the world, that somehow we can visit when we're dead, and spoiler, we'll talk about this when we talk about Plato as well, that just seems super weird. Now, there are of course degrees of weirdness, so more weird worse, less weird better, and whether something's weird or not, just like with anything, like food choices or clothing, depends a lot on the person. So, for someone who thinks universals are very plausible, this all seems, just fine. Just think of someone who dresses in a way you might think is weird, or eats food you think is weird. To them, it's probably perfectly normal. And in our cases, there are people who think that, the food that you or I might eat could be really weird. So weirdness is a minus, but it can be rather subjective. So kind of the challenge is, showing how it's weird or mysterious and why that's a problem. So simplicity good, weirdness bad. Next is plausibility. Now, as you might imagine, the more plausible a theory is, the better. So how do we tell what's plausible and what's not? Well, we typically do this by matching a theory against our intuitions, which is how we kind of feel about things before we put a lot of thought into it. Now, while this standard is reasonable, theories that are less plausible would have, greater cost. Those that are more plausible would cost less. There is a degree of subjectivity about intuitions. One person feels is intuitively plausible, another may see as absurd. To use an extreme example, think about weird but popular but seemingly crazy conspiracy theories that have been thoroughly debunked. Like, for example, 5G causing, COVID-19. Now, to someone who knows about viruses and 5G, the idea that 5G is causing coronavirus would be just wildly implausible against their intuitions. But someone else, it may feel entirely plausible. And if you're familiar with, conspiracy theories, people believe them, and it feels very intuitive to them. And so there are cases where people can have extreme clashes in intuition. Now, this also occurs in normal cases, because you can have non-conspiracy cases with people who are, rational and sensible, who have clashing intuitions about things. What they think about things can be quite different. So, plausibility, although reasonable standard, there is a challenge of sorting out what seems plausible. Again, going back to our good dead friend Plato, his forms seem totally plausible to him, but they seem pretty crazy to me, because I think universals are, weird and crazy. But I think Plato had good arguments for them, despite that. Next, primitives. Now, by this he doesn't mean, or we don't mean like low tech, like in terms of it's stone tools and bear skins and that kind of stuff. In this case, what it means is this: A primitive in this context is something, such as an entity, concept, or relation, that is not analyzed or explained by the theory. Roughly put, you just leave it as it is. You leave it unexplained, unanalyzed. These typically are, or are comparable to, assumptions that you have to make. And every theory, every explanation begins with some assumptions, because you have to start somewhere. Otherwise, you'd be caught up in what's called an infinite regress. And we'll talk about that in the future. Because if you had to analyze or explain everything, you would never finish. Because everything you explained, you have to explain that. And so you always have to take some things as primitive, as unexplained, unanalyzed. So all theories require these. You have to have some type of starting point. But since the whole point of a theory is to explain things, the fewer things you leave unexplained, the fewer things you leave as primitive, the better. So it's a mark against a theory to have, lots of primitives. But since all theories have to use primitives, it's not a defect, that can be leveled against any particular theory, because everyone has to do this. And so it's kind of a battle of who's got too many primitives, and are people taking what are seen as the wrong things to be primitive? And there's, as you might imagine, a lot of debate about that. Explanatory power and problem solving. Now, the more that a theory explains, the better, because with theories, kind of the name of the game is explaining things. And the better the solution a theory offers to the problem or problems it addresses, the better. And so this is a major benefit. So more explanatory power, more problem solving, those are pluses. So if you have a theory that does explain a lot, that does solve the problem, and does a good job at it, that's obviously a big plus. Now, of course, one sort of irony here is if you have a theory that purports to explain everything, explains too much, that can be grounds for suspicion, because it may seem to be in a way too good, and then it's worth checking to see if it is in fact too good. But as a general rule, the more the theory explains effectively and well, the better. The better it solves the problem it aims to solve, clearly the better. Now, there are also potential spin-offs from theories, and this is called fruitfulness. And these are other benefits of a theory, including its usefulness in areas beyond its original purpose. And although these are kind of, these are extra benefits, the more the better. So if, for example, suppose you develop a theory of what it is to be a person, and it has important implications for ethics, for sorting out, addressing the problems of, say, abortion, euthanasia, etc., and issues of personhood, other issues of personhood and ethics, then that would be a plus for the theory, because it does more good stuff. Now, in technology and business, this is known as sort of like spin-offs. So, for example, we have the space program, but the space program, in addition to doing what it's supposed to do, which is basically for us to show the Russians, the Soviets back then, that we can get stuff done better than they can, it also had huge spin-offs. And a good example, of course, would be, GPS locations. If you use your phone with GPS, or you have like one of the, say, Garmin running watches or another brand that tracks your miles, not by steps but by your GPS location, that's an example of a spin-off. And you often get a lot of spin-offs from technology, things that it's not the original purpose of the technology, but it's something it's useful for that people figure out to do. And theories can be the same way. You can get sort of these extra spin-offs. Now, there are also some things that theories have to do that are sort of just basic requirements for not being just bad. One is a theory has to be coherent. If it's not coherent, that is to say, if it's not, if it's incoherent, it's inconsistent or even contradictory, then that would make it a bad theory, because its parts would be, problematic. So incoherent theories are generally bad. And of course, going along with this is consistency. A theory needs to be internally consistent at the very least. And so a theory is inconsistent when claims within the theory are contradictory, which means one of them must be false, or are contrary, which means they both cannot be true. So the problem with inconsistency within a theory is that it's got to contain stuff that is untrue. It's got to be wrong about some things. And that's generally a bad thing. Now, there's also, of course, being inconsistent with already established theories. So if a theory doesn't match up with, say, existing theories, plausible claims, that can be problematic. But of course, you could have a theory that is the correct theory, and other theories could be wrong, and it wouldn't match up with them. Lastly, a theory needs to be non-circular, non-question begging. Being circular, or question begging, means that a theory would simply restate what it's trying to explain. It would also be circular if it assumes what it needs to prove. And this, of course, would be a flaw. If it simply restates what it's trying to explain, it doesn't help you. If it assumes what it needs to prove, that doesn't help either. So those are ways to assess theories. And so when looking at a theory or a solution to a problem, those are things to consider. And so a quick recap would be Occam's razor. Is it accepting entities that are unnecessary? And if the answer is yes, that increases its cost. Is the theory needlessly complicated or more complicated than its plausible rivals? If the answer is yes, that's a minus. If it's got good simplicity, that's a plus. For the mystery and weirdness, if a theory is needlessly mysterious or weird, that's a minus. If a theory is plausible, that's a plus. All theories have to have primitives, unexplained and unanalyzed things, but to the degree that it has more of them, or it doesn't do a very good job, in justifying taking certain things to be primitive, that would be a minus. Explanatory power and problem solving are pluses. Fruitfulness is a plus. Coherence and consistency and non-circularity are just kind of basic things that theory has to have. If it's incoherent or inconsistent or circular, those are bad. And so those are kind of the, rules of the game of doing metaphysics, or at least a particular kind. Again, this is not the only way to do metaphysics, but it's kind of the standard approach in, historical and modern metaphysics. So that brings us to the end of what is metaphysics.